the trenchant nature of American individualism and this idea that we can get out of big problems on our own, that pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps is a sign of strength and worth, rather than the collective attitudes necessary to deal with something that absolutely affects all of us through our connections with each other.
It seems that you should generally be suspicious of anyone who suggests that they can predict the future. But in 2016, Ed Yong did just that, laying out how a global pandemic would spread with his signature journalistic clarity, and only increasing our trust in him as a reporter and clear-eyed writer. As he shows, this is the practice of evidence-based imagination, to look at our world and understand how history has shaped our present moment in every way. Yong's presentation of facts makes him a superb journalist, and his even-handed writing style that invites the reader to engage deeply with scientific inquiry makes each of his books essential. As he urges us, quote, "You have to run towards complexity." Often our instincts push us towards extreme positions, dichotomies, when in fact, we're dealing with spectrums. I'm Rebecca Hoogs, the Executive Director of Seattle Arts and Lectures. This is Sal on Air, a collection of talks from the world's best writers from the 37 years of Seattle Arts and Lectures. Ed Yong's best-selling first book, I Contain Multitudes, prompted us to look at ourselves and the microbes we contain as the interconnected, interdependent systems that we are. And his follow-up book, An Immense World, was named one of the best books of the year by numerous publications, while opening our eyes to the glorious world right before us. Yong visited Sal virtually in 2022 when microbes were in the news every day and the onslaught of new information overwhelmed us. His talk on the nature of journalism did us a world of good. Following the reading, Yong is joined by independent journalist Wu-Dan Yan. Together we hear them discuss the nature and function of journalism, how to build trust with readers, the falsity of pure objectivity, and more. This is Sal on Air.
Hi, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining me tonight. I'm sorry this had to be virtual. Sadly, a variant got in the way, but I hope this will be interesting to you nonetheless. I'm going to spend the next half an hour to 45 minutes talking about my approach to journalism during the pandemic, what I have tried to achieve in my work and how I tried to achieve it, and how I'm thinking about our responsibilities in this current phase of the pandemic. So I want to start actually well before COVID was even a thing. In 2016, in December, after the election of Donald Trump, I wrote a piece for The Atlantic called How a Pandemic Will Likely Play Out Under Trump. Pandemics and preparedness for pandemics was something I'd been thinking about for a little while. I'd been a science writer for more than a decade. I'd written about a bunch of different things, including infectious diseases. And I was interested in how the almost inevitable threat of a new emerging disease would play out in the context of a president who, even as a citizen and a candidate, seemed to reject empiricism, harmness, solidarity. And a lot of the predictions in that piece, I think, bore out. In it, I wrote, as Donald Trump prepares to become America's 45th president, the question isn't whether he'll face a deadly outbreak during his presidency, but when, and more importantly, how will he cope? And that piece for me really set the scene for everything that was to come, and not just because it talked about pandemics. The prediction, in many ways, is not actually that important. What is important to me is the approach. Something that over the last couple of years, others have referred to as the journalism of evidence-based imagination, a term that I really like. At its core is this idea that we have actually all the information we need from the past, both distant and recent, to make educated and often accurate guesses about how enormous events are going to shape our future. And that this approach of trying to say something about the future, given what we know about the past, is crucial to the way we should approach our stories about some of the biggest challenges of our time. But it's also, I think, a difficult thing to do because many of our instincts as journalists work against it. We are so laser focused on the now, or on the present. That is, of course, what we do. We write about the news, things that are novel, things that are happening right now. This is a laudable and often very useful instinct, but it also creates large oblivious spots around our field of vision that make us less in tune, both with what could happen and what has already happened. When COVID hit, a lot of people, from the president to many people in the media to many of my readers, were very surprised. They felt that it was something that no one could have predicted, something highly unusual. But in fact, many of the people who I'd been talking to for years had absolutely predicted that something like this would happen. And you could see it in the pace and the cadence of such events over the last several decades. Every president in recent memory had to deal with either a new or a re-emerging infection. Obama, over his 8 years as president, had 4 such things to deal with. He had H1N1, swine flu. He had MERS, another coronavirus. He had Ebola, the largest outbreak in history in West Africa. And he had, of course, Zika. It was not, therefore, a bold claim in that piece I wrote in 2016 to suggest that Donald Trump would experience something like this, because the pace, the drumbeat of history suggested that a challenge like that would occur. Now, would it inevitably have been a pandemic of the scale and the import that we have seen? Possibly not. But again, such things have happened before, and many experts had warned for a long time that such things would be possible again. And given that, many of the foundations of our failures in the pandemic, how badly prepared the United States turned out to be, were also predictable beforehand. And many of the qualities that allowed the coronavirus to spread more quickly and that made it harder for this nation to fight against it were all pretty self-evident. The packed states of our prisons, the underfunded and under-resourced nature of our nursing homes, a public health system that had been compromised through lack of funding for decades, a hospital system which under the best of circumstances is spread too thin and runs on a just-in-time economy, the trenchant nature of American individualism and this idea that we can get out of big problems on our own, that pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps is a sign of strength and worth, rather than the collective attitudes necessary to deal with something that absolutely affects all of us through our connections with each other. All of these things were evident before. And so the fact that we struggled so much shouldn't really have been a surprise, and yet it was. Even, researchers who've been thinking about pandemics for a long time overestimated how well the United States would do. An index that ranked countries by how prepared they were, famously in 2019 ranked the US number 1, and yet the number of deaths, the toll that the pandemic has taken upon us is far greater than many other nations that were ranked considerably lower and that had much fewer resources. Similarly, what happened after vaccines became widely available was also utterly predictable. We had very senior scientists like Francis Collins, former director of the NIH, talking about how the sheer amount of anti-vaccine sentiment and skepticism in this country came as a massive surprise. But frankly, that is itself surprising because those attitudes have been rife. They were evident to anyone who thought about things like the long-standing debate about MMR and autism, They should have been evident to anyone who noted that trust in this country, one of the greatest predictors of attitudes to things like vaccine, had been falling. Trust in each other, trust in the government. I talked about how badly hospitals have been hit, and in writing about the recent hospital crisis, many readers have expressed astonishment to me that our hospitals could be so badly overwhelmed, that healthcare workers could be burning out so much, that people could be sitting in waiting rooms for days sometimes, waiting for treatment in this country with our resources, with our medical might. How is that possible? Again, the weaknesses were evident. The public health system, as I said, had been strained long beforehand, limiting the nation's ability to keep sick people out of hospital in the first place. There were nursing shortages, which people were talking about well before the pandemic. Burnout among healthcare workers was evident, a problem that had reared its head long before COVID was a thing. Our hospitals were stretched thin even by a vigorous flu season, let alone by a new, deadly, rapidly spreading pathogen. Not last year, my God. In the summer of 2020, I wrote a big magazine story for The Atlantic with the cover tagline, "How did it come to this?" about America's pandemic failures. That piece mentioned Donald Trump, but was not just about him. It was also about everything else. In it, I wrote that water running along a pavement will readily seep into every crack. And so too did the unchecked coronavirus seep into every fault line in the modern world. The US, in many ways, and like a lot of other countries, was primed to fail at a pandemic because it embraced a version of normal that made it vulnerable. And it is that version of normal that many of us now so intensely want to return to. But as I wrote in that piece and in others, normal led to this. And so this is the critical bit to realize. All the flaws were glaring and present well before SARS-CoV-2 ever first left a bat. And writing pieces about how these flaws might manifest as we move forward. And now me talking in retrospect about how these things were predictable, that isn't in itself a virtue, right? Like, no one gets points here for predicting tragedy. COVID Cassandra is not a mantle of honor. My point is more that we actually can make very informed guesses about what will happen, and we can see the ways in which our current actions influence our future. It's a huge part to me of what journalism is capable of and what it sometimes fails to shoot for. Our field often gravitates towards fragmentation. We chip small pieces off bigger stories and show them to people one at a time. In science writing, often the atomic unit of science writing is this individual paper. We write about single papers one at a time. And that sometimes works. A lot of my career was founded on exactly that. But it is a tough mode of work for a crisis as big as the pandemic, something that touches on every facet of our society, that involves 1,000 puzzle pieces of disparate bits of information. Showing those pieces to readers one at a time often just generates more confusion and more uncertainty. Uncertainty, anxiety, and confusion create the rich loam on which misinformation can thrive. Instead of doing that, what I tried to do from the start of the pandemic was to write bigger pieces that answered the bigger questions. I wanted people to come away from these pieces feeling like they really understood what was happening. I didn't just want to tell people what is happening. I wanted to help them to make sense of it. I've said use this analogy to death, so bear with me if you've heard it before, but I think about the pandemic like a raging torrent of information and misinformation, like these fast-moving rapids that we're all being swept along in. What I think good journalism can do is to create a stable platform amid that torrent, something for our readers to stand upon so they can observe the chaos around them so they can see what is happening without themselves being submerged and swept away by it. And that is a challenging thing to do because obviously you are in the torrent and you are being swept away and submerged yourself. But that is what I tried to do over the last 2 years. In 2020, I wrote big pieces about how the pandemic will end, why the coronavirus is so confusing, why we all seem to be trapped in this spiral of endless bad decisions. How did it come to this? It felt in that first year like the goal was to answer the questions that people were asking amongst each other and had maybe not even realized that they were asking. And then in the second year, as vaccinations became more common, it felt like the goal for me shifted from answering the questions that everyone was asking to answering the questions that people had forgotten to ask. I wrote pieces in 2021 about the trauma of the pandemic, what happens when people can finally get a chance to exhale, and what happens to those who suddenly find themselves broken. I wrote about the cost of individualism, how this tendency to think only of ourselves hampered the early parts of our pandemic response and continued to hamper us through decisions like the CDC deciding that vaccinated people no longer needed to mask indoors, to the Biden administration's decision to pursue vaccines as a singular strategy at the expense of others. In November, I wrote a piece about how healthcare workers were quitting the industry in droves. And that piece was published at the trough of the hospitalization curve, at a point when the Delta surge had waned and before Omicron was a thing. And I wrote that piece at that time because I knew from past reporting that often healthcare workers go through the toughest times, the surges, on adrenaline and camaraderie, a fervent desire to do right by their patients and by their colleagues. And it's only in the lulls when a lot of them collapse, when they realize how burnt out they are, when they realize how betrayed they were by their institutions and by some of the people they decide they tried to care for. And it's at that moment when many of them decided to leave. I'm especially proud of that piece because I think it presaged a lot of what happened to healthcare workers during the subsequent Omicron surge. All of this is hard work. Each of these pieces feels a lot like writing a master's thesis, more like writing a magazine feature. Each of them demands at least a dozen interviews, if not up to 40 for some of the biggest pieces. And notably, I think helping people make sense of things is a very different activity than simply telling them what is happening, and it requires very different skills. First, you need to go broad. I tried in these pieces to synthesize across a large number of disciplines and sources. Yes, the pandemic is very much a health and science story, but it is not only a health and science story. It touches on every aspect of our lives. It touches on our schools, our prisons and nursing homes, the national psyche, its long-standing attitudes to what medicine can accomplish, the division between medicine and public health, all of that. I could go on, and I will over the course of this talk. But my point is that to understand the pandemic, what I've termed as an omnicrisis and therefore is sort of an omni-story, you need to know more than just virology or epidemiology. You also need to delve into the social sciences, into history, into so much more. Virologists and immunologists can tell you about whether immunity to COVID lasts. Historians and sociologists can tell you whether immunity passports are a good idea. Clinicians can tell you whether being strong protects you from the virus. Anthropologists and linguists can tell you why we keep pretending that it does. In the areas that I cover, expertise tends to be deep but narrow. People know a lot about the specific areas that they are experts in, but often have quite a shallow understanding of everything else. And as a journalist, my job is to pass those types of expertise and to select the people who are the best sources for the stories I'm telling. There has been this tendency throughout the pandemic of treating anyone with medical qualifications as an expert on all things pandemic. And it's simply not true. Even within the health sphere, doctors, people trained in medicine, bring a completely different perspective than people trained in public health. The former deals with the health of individuals, healing them when they are sick. The latter deals with the health of entire populations, trying to prevent them from getting sick in the first place. Each of those brings different sets of knowledge to the table. And it is ludicrous to pretend that any one person can be a expert voice on all things pandemic. I myself have tried really hard to not be a pundit, to only weigh in on the types of things that I have done specific reporting on. And in that reporting, I've tried very hard not to just call up the same damn people again and again and again. In every piece that I write, at least half of the people I talk to are people who I've talked to for the first time. I'm constantly trying to refresh my pool of sources to make sure that I'm not just listening to the same perspectives from the same people that every other journalist is also talking to. Secondly, you have to look in the rearview mirror. Again, we are very, very focused on the now, and I think that we are missing important stories as a result. The piece I wrote about pandemic trauma was written last April at a time when many people who had been vaccinated thought that they could just move on from COVID. I wanted to look at the people who felt that they couldn't move on, who were still suffering with grief and trauma, and who frankly were shocked and dismayed at how little sympathy that they were being extended by other people around them. Likewise, as I said, the healthcare worker piece I wrote in November was about people who weren't actually being overwhelmed by the pandemic at that time, but were still suffering from the aftermath of previous surges. The toll of COVID cannot just be measured by what the graphs in the New York Times are doing in the current moment. They are collective. They accrue over time. And so we have to continue looking at groups who've been harmed in the past if we are to make sense of what the pandemic present is actually like for large parts of the population. The third, you have to grapple with uncertainty. One of the most common mistakes that people make when they start writing about science is to treat it as a procession of facts, as a set of uncontested discoveries. It is not that at all. Science is a human endeavor, and humans are fallible. They're messy and they're erratic. And so science is messy and erratic. It's not a steady procession of facts. It is a process at which we stumble towards gradually reduced uncertainty. And that path towards reduced uncertainty is going to look really messy if you cover every step along the way. If you cover every single study, the picture that people get will be stroboscopic. It will flash in and out. It will change from one moment to the next. As I said, doing that may work under normal circumstances or for smaller stories, but for one of this scope, I tried actually quite hard to avoid writing about individual papers one at a time, but instead to write about large bodies of information and to synthesize them for my readers. Part of science being a human endeavor means that people disagree about a lot. And so almost none of the pieces that I wrote were ever an interview with just one person. I don't write down what Tony Fauci thinks and call it a piece. I try to talk to a wide variety of people for every story and to sort of check their expertise against each other. In interviews, I try and paraphrase people, both the people I'm talking to right now and people I've talked to before. This is what I've heard. Is this right? How do you think about that? What you've just told me makes me think X and Y. Have I got the right end of the stick? Do you disagree with any of that? I ask people what might change their minds about views that they hold, what other people get wrong about the areas they're experts in, what's the catch in what they've just told me, how confident they are on a scale of 1 to 10 in the prediction that they just made. if there is uncertainty, and there has been much over the pandemic, I've tried to, instead of just coming up with an answer that may or may not be wrong, to instead try and look at that uncertainty, to try and explain to people why it exists. Why is it that we don't know the answers here? What are the sources of error? How might they be resolved? And over what time frame might they be resolved? Which leads me to the fourth point. You have to run towards complexity. Yes, people want answers, but if answers aren't there to give, then we have to be truthful about that. And often our instincts push us towards extreme positions and towards dichotomies when in fact we're dealing with spectrums. When variants first emerged, vaccinated people were not fully safe, but they were still much safer than unvaccinated people. In the Delta era, breakthrough infections were relatively rare, but it wouldn't feel rare because many people would know someone who had them. This tendency to say it's one thing or the other, that either this, everything is terrible or that everything is fine, does lead us astray, as does the tendency to create false dichotomies. And there have been so many throughout the pandemic. We've talked about lockdowns or reopenings as if our only choices were to cloister ourselves for months away, or to abandon all precautions and to open everything up as normal. Obviously, there are huge shades of grey in the middle of those things, and pandemic restrictions are much more like dimmer switches than on and off light switches. A similar example happened quite recently during the Omicron surge, where a lot of people made a distinction between people who were hospitalized for COVID, that is because of their coronavirus infections, or with COVID, with the idea being that some people were incidentally sick with COVID. They had incidental COVID infections. They went into hospitals with things like broken limbs or injuries from car accidents or appendicitis, and just happened to test positive for COVID. If you actually talk to a lot of doctors and nurses, it turns out that distinction is much more complicated. There were a huge number of people who absolutely were in hospital because of COVID, but not just with the standard things like pneumonia. A lot of people had chronic conditions that were severely exacerbated by the coronavirus. They might have had heart problems that were made worse. There may have been diabetics who went through crashes. It might have been just elderly people who got weak and fell at home. People who wouldn't have been in the hospital had it not been for COVID, but who wouldn't have COVID registered on their admissions forms. That distinction for or with COVID was another way in which we inaccurately, misleadingly dichotomize something with actually quite a lot of nuance in it. And I found that one really important thing to do is just to ground truth that, like try and talk to people who actually have a sense of what is happening on the ground, instead of just looking at sources of data whose nuances you don't understand. And finally, I think the fifth thing I wanted to say is you have to really think hard about the way in which problems are framed. And I'll give you two examples. I talked a lot already about individualism. And from its founding, the United States has cultivated a national mythos around the capacity of individuals to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, ostensibly on their own merits. This line of thinking is actually a huge problem because the pandemic is fundamentally a collective problem for the very, very basic reason that diseases spread. The Biden administration, Rochelle Walensky, the CDC, have repeatedly talked about how your health is in your hands, but no one's health is fully in their own hands. Our health all depends on each other, especially in the context of an infectious disease. And at every stage of the pandemic, collective risk has outweighed individual risk. It has been the lens through which we really need to understand what is happening. Consider just the Omicron variant. Less severe than Delta. It is certainly the case that someone who is sick with COVID now, on average, is a little less sick than someone who was sick with COVID about a year ago. But that doesn't mean that it's mild. A lot of people are still severely sick, including immunocompromised people, people with pre-existing health problems, and a lot of unvaccinated people. And even if that weren't true, Omicron would still be a huge problem because of how quickly it spreads. It spread so quickly that the huge influx of cases can still overwhelm hospitals, and absolutely did. And even if a smaller proportion of those cases were severely ill, that's enough to fill ICUs around the country. So each individual may have had a slightly lower risk of COVID, of severe illness than they did in 2020, especially if they were vaccinated. But there's enough of them to still overwhelm the healthcare system, on which every individual then still relies upon. There was many people who turned up to an emergency room with problems completely unrelated to COVID, and yet had to wait for hours, sometimes days, for care because the system was so stressed by this so-called milder variant. The pandemic, to control it, has always relied on people making sacrifices for each other, often at their own inconvenience and personal expense. And it relies on governments enacting policies that protect entire communities instead of privileging the most people with the easiest and earliest access to care. Instead of asking, what's my risk? People need to ask, what's my contribution to everyone else's risk? And yet, so many pandemic voices, pundits in newspapers, op-ed writers, even many people who work in public health, seem to only be able to think about the pandemic in the context of individual risk analysis. What is my personal risk of illness and death? And that is the only lens through which they make their decisions. If we do that, if that is the only way we think about the pandemic, we will continue to fail at this and at the ones to come. And yet, not only is that what is happening, but people have been mocked for thinking collectively. Young people have been told that they're irrational because their personal risk is low, and some of them are still wearing masks, with no thought about how those people might be thinking about infecting the more vulnerable people around them. The second example I'll give is about the way we think about vaccines and drugs and the other fruits of the biomedical enterprise. There was a time in the late 19th century when many people thought about epidemics as social problems. The thinkers of the time saw that epidemics spread more quickly under conditions of societal rot and the conditions of poverty, poor education, lack of poor dilapidated housing, unsafe working environments. They understood that health, that medicine was a social problem, and that it demanded big social reforms to fix. A lot of that attitude went away in the early 20th century because of germ theory, as people identified microbes as the root cause of a lot of illnesses. They then ignored the social context in which people who were infected by those microbes lived. Health simply became a battle between host and pathogen. And all the context that shaped the circumstances of that battle became ignored. That biomedical paradigm said that epidemic diseases could best be treated by focusing solely on eradicating the pathogen within the body of the individual through things like drugs, and eventually by protecting people with vaccinations. And that point of view very much is still alive today. It explains why both the Trump and Biden administrations have been so laser focused on vaccines as the way out of the pandemic, and have been comparatively low to put in a lot of the social measures that would help people actually protect themselves. Paid sick leave is a really, really obvious and frequently cited one. If people are unable to isolate when sick, they're going to find it harder to protect their loved ones, to protect their colleagues, and viruses will spread more quickly as a result. But those kinds of social measures have rarely been put on the table. Even, despite having talked about this for almost a year and a half, and despite many people in public health talking about exactly this, the preparedness plan that the Biden administration put out for future pandemics place scarce mention to this. It channels a huge amount of money into developing things like vaccines and drugs without taking into account these social issues that address many of the inequities that have allowed the pandemic to rage so furiously in the US. Even now, people, a lot of the administration's advisors talk a lot about things like preparing for the next pandemic by ensuring that we can make vaccines more quickly. 100 days is a commonly cited goal. I would love that personally, but I don't think that's going to get us out of the kinds of situations we're currently facing, especially because a lot of vaccine hesitancy comes from people thinking that the development process was rushed. Moving that faster isn't going to do anything to address many of the large problems of trust that we still face. And the fact that we're still thinking of it in those ways means that we're still ignoring large parts of the problem, the social dimension of pandemics that we have failed so badly at. The point I want to make on this is that we often think of misinformation in a very limited way. We think of misinformation essentially as pieces of trivia that are incorrect. Does hydroxychloroquine work against COVID? The answer is no. A lot of people say yes, misinformation. But you can also misinform people by teaching them how to think about the problem in unproductive ways. So when I think about misinformation, I don't just think about a Fox News anchor raising doubts about vaccines. I also think about liberal commentators teaching people to only think in terms of their individual risk instead of our collective risk, to see this as a purely biomedical problem instead of an inherently social one, to center the privileged instead of the vulnerable. Journalism is not just about providing information. It's about setting our values, it's about setting the things, the ways of thinking that we as a society prioritize. I wrote a piece towards the end of last year about cancelling a 40th birthday party because of the spread of the Omicron variant. And the party is the least of it, right? No one gives a shit about me turning 40. The whole point of the piece was to walk through my thinking as I think about this problem. The fact that individually, I am at incredibly low risk. I have a ton of privilege. I have 3 vaccine shots in me. If I got Omicron, I would probably be fine. But I might also give it to people who would not be fine. Being born a week in front of Christmas, it pretty much creates the perfect conditions for creating a super spreader event that then allows my loved ones to take the virus to their own families, including people who might be vulnerable in ways I couldn't predict. Elderly people, immunocompromised people. Again, the intention of that piece was to show how to think through a problem that so many of us are thinking about, so many of us have been forced to make difficult decisions about. To me, sense-making is not just about determining the correct information, but also how to think about it, how to feel about it. The emotional side of this is important too, especially for a tragedy that has cost us so much, that has frayed our mental health. What I want to instill in my readers is a sense of understanding, but also a sense of calm, stability, of resolve. The emails that I get, the feedback that I get that matters most to me are the ones from people saying that this work has helped them feel steadier in their decisions, has made them feel more informed about the difficult choices they've had to make. And I know this is a bit weird because a lot of these pieces are incredibly depressing, but I do also try and instill them with a sense of hope. And I will get to that later, that no matter how bleak things looked, that a better future is actually possible. This matters to me personally because the cost of this work has been enormous. Not to my health, that's fine, but staring the full scope of the pandemic in the face for a lot of years has been really hard for my mental health. I've had anxiety, I've had depression. It's been difficult to sleep. Working on this has been incredibly stressful. I can tell you that I constantly feel like the work is inadequate, but also that I've never worked as hard as I have before. And it still feels like it's not enough. The stakes feel immeasurably high. I constantly second guess myself about whether the things I've written are accurate, whether the frames of analysis that I've used are the right ones. But I think that this matters. I think that it's in moments like this of intense confusion in societal upheaval that the role of journalism matters more than ever, and that what we can hope to accomplish is significant. I am continuing to try and use my platform at The Atlantic and to use my skill set to shine a light on stories of the pandemic that I think can do the most good. And for me, that involves talking about things, about groups that are often not being heard, not being seen. I'm writing a piece right now about how immunocompromised people have fared over the 2 years of the pandemic. I've written many stories about how people with long COVID have felt marginalized and dismissed, mirroring the experiences that people with other complex chronic illnesses like ME and dysautonomia have faced in the years before. Even the pieces I've written about healthcare workers sort of fit that mold. They're hardly people you would necessarily think of as being a marginalized group, but many of them feel dismissed and overlooked as the pandemic has worn on. So much of society feels intent on going back to normal, and their collective choices and the political inaction from our governments have meant that healthcare workers cannot, that they're still trapped in horrible and exhausting and demoralizing surges, one after the next. I feel for them. I feel a lot of sympathy for the perspective that much of society has moved on and that they feel trapped. I also feel that way. I think that I feel a lot of responsibility to continue reporting on areas of the pandemic that that don't get enough coverage, while so much attention is paid on this push to reopen, on to go back to normal, and to pretend that COVID isn't a problem anymore, when it very much is. It feels like large swaths of my profession felt personally safe, got vaccinated and lowered their individual risk, and therefore decided that everyone's collective risk was also low, and that the pandemic was not a problem because for them it wasn't a problem. It is hard to continue holding that line, but I do think there are reasons to do it. Firstly, because I think actually changing people's minds is still possible. I have had wonderful messages from readers saying that the work that I've done has helped them to reach out to people who've been skeptical, who've been unconvinced by the threat of COVID. The work has helped people to bridge gaps with skeptical friends, conservative family members. It's changed the way I think about how we reach our audiences. Instead of just creating work that is read by a reader who likely already knows about The Atlantic and is sympathetic to a point of view, it actually functions in a much deeper way. It allows conversations to open up between those readers and the people around them. It radiates far further than we might possibly imagine. I also think that preaching to converted is actually not a bad thing. As I've said, like increasing the resolve of people whose resolve is faltering is actually a really worthy cause, and providing validation to people who feel unheard and unseen, bearing witness to suffering, is one of the most profound and sacred things we can do. And I've had so many messages from healthcare workers who finally feel seen, who long haulers, who finally understand more about what is happening to them. Those are the kinds of reactions that keep me still doing this work. And even when I think that it doesn't matter, when it feels like you're shouting into the abyss, it still matters that someone is shouting. I remember very early on in the pandemic, I talked to a colleague who reports on racial issues in the US and asked him how he kept on finding the strength to do the work that he does despite the seeming lack of progress. And he said that if it is destined that we can only learn in hindsight, then someone still has to provide that hindsight. And that's how I feel now. We might continue to suck at this. We might get to another pandemic and perform just as badly as we've done here. I actually think that's probably quite likely. But it won't be because no one said anything. It won't be because no one talked about how we can do better. It sometimes feels hopeless. I feel that a lot, but I also think that we cannot afford the luxury of nihilism. My dear friend Rose Eberleth, a journalist who hosted the incredible podcast Flash Forward, talks about our need to imagine better futures, that despite how grim things might look, the future is ours to imagine, to decide what we want to do with. And I think that's really important. I said that the true value of journalism isn't just in telling us what is happening, but also in helping us to make sense of it. And partly making sense of it involves understanding what is possible, that even if things look bleak, that a better, more stable, kinder future is still within our grasp. And our work can show people that we can get there and how to get there. And I'll leave it there.
We'll be back for the rest of the event with Ed Yong in a moment. But first, I wanted to tell you about an event coming up with Merlin Sheldrake on May 21st. A plant scientist, microbiologist, and ecologist, Merlin Sheldrake has dedicated his scientific career to the relationship between humans and more than human organisms. His book, Entangled Life: How Fungi Make Our Worlds, has been recognized by the BBC, Time, and more, and has been heralded as dazzling, eye-opening, inspiring, and a groundbreaking account of the extraordinarily strange world of mushrooms. Tickets are available now for both in-person and online attendance at lectures.org. And now, more from Ed Yong.
All right. Hi, Ed. Thank you for that
great
talk. Good to see you. And
good to see you too.
Yeah. Thank you, as always, for making sense of the torrent of information for us. It's an important public service, even so, in these times. I wanted to start our discussion tonight actually about trust. So Seattle Arts and Lectures began this series a few years ago due to the attacks on the press. And of course, science is also under attack and politicized. But in preparation for our conversation, I asked a lot of people who they were reading, they were very intensely following as journalists feeding them information. And perhaps it's not a surprise, but many named you and your colleagues at The Atlantic. So I'd love to think about how you've thought about building trust with readers, whether it is yourself individually or collectively with the rest of your team on the science desk.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've heard variants of this before in lots of different contexts, right? So how can we build trust in journalism? How can we build trust in science? How can we build trust in healthcare professionals? And I think that the question we should really be asking is, how can we in these professions prove ourselves to be trustworthy? People aren't going to trust us if we don't deserve that. And so we have to deserve that. And so the question is how to actually do that, how to prove worthy of people's trust. For me, I think it's about holding true to the tenets of journalism, of being honest, of being fair, not being falsely objective, not shooting for some kind of fake neutrality, but to actually make genuine, open-minded attempts to answer the questions that people have and to show them how we do that. So as I said, I try and run towards complexity. I try and showcase uncertainty. I try and be very clear about where the boundaries of my own knowledge are. Me personally, I've tried very hard to not become a pandemic pundit. I don't tweet about the newest developments in the pandemic without having reported on them first. My opinion doesn't matter, I think. My reporting matters. The value that I bring to this is through the work I do, not the thoughts that I shoot off. And the same goes for, we do the Atlantic is a conduit between us and the rest of the media. We do a lot of interviews after our pieces. And I've made it very clear to our comms folks, and they've been very supportive in this, that I'm not going to do an interview that asks about like the news of the day, because often I don't have a view on it and I haven't done the necessary work. I will only talk about things that I've actually done reporting on. And that's how, so part of this, a lot of this to me is about maintaining my own integrity as a journalist, like holding to the values that I hold dear. And I hope that in doing that, it comes across to readers. Like I'm actually not trying to, I don't approach these things with like, what is the message or like, what is the answer? It often just comes from a question and a genuine, curious attempt to try and answer that question for people.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And kind of related to that, I wanted to ask about how you think about, again, making further sense from your reporting, because in a lot of your pieces, you talk about the perils of individualism and how it's important to think for the collective good. So I want to play this thought experiment with you. It might be a little wonky, but
all right, let's do it.
I have waved a wand. You are now leader of the free world, America.
Oh no.
With your...
The birthers would get me.
Yeah. With your collective knowledge, what are some measures or guidelines that you would put in place to get this pandemic under control? And how do you think about getting people to comply?
Yeah. So I think I look to structural problems rather than individual ones. So the whole last bit of the question, like how do you get people to comply, is partly about like, we think about pandemic solutions in terms of things like masking. We sort of judge their failure by whether people are willing to put up a mask or not. But you can mandate that, and that's partly why things like vaccine mandates and mask mandates are powerful tools, because they push people towards acting for the collective good. And, so a lot of those measures are harder now, like legally, some of them can't be put into place in a lot of parts of the country. But there are other structural measures that we could put in place. Some of them are being rolled out too little too late, like everyone gets 4 rapid tests, right? Like we could have done that at a much greater scale before. Could have made more efforts to improve ventilation standards, to offer things like paid sick leave that I've already talked about. Specific parts of the country have done good jobs at this, about doing things like creating free accommodation where people who are sick can isolate. Workplace policies, just things like allowing sick people to work from home, giving people who are immunocompromised the flexibility of remote working, something that we did for a year, and so for some reason have decided that we need to roll back. Like a lot of these measures are much less about you do this specific thing as a citizen, but putting in the bedrock for a society that finds it easier to make sensible choices. We do this for other things too, for like we don't leave road safety up to individuals. I mean, sure, we do to an extent, right? It's down to you and me whether we speed on a motorway, but there are laws about wearing seatbelts, about things like speeding, about stop signs. So we actually have a gigantic infrastructure in place for that. And we could have that for infectious diseases too. It's sort of weird that we don't have that. And I think if we do prioritize those kinds of things, we do a much better job at dealing with some of the inequities that have plagued the pandemic from the start.
Yeah, I hear you imagining kind of a different society in a way.
Right. Like this has been an immense tragedy, but it also was an opportunity. It's an opportunity to imagine how we can actually do much better than how we've done now. Like I've talked about immunocompromised people. I've just been writing about this today. Like a lot of people, went through life before the pandemic, just getting colds and flus and getting very sick as a result, and sort of thinking like, that's just how the world works. It sort of sucks for me, but I need to tolerate that to be part of society. And then like they suddenly had things like remote working options. And a lot of people were really fastidious about infection control. Basically, got rid of the flu for about a year. And now you're telling people who suddenly realize actually a better world is possible, like a safer world, that they can't have that anymore. That's really hard. And maybe that's not what we should be doing. Maybe we should realize that normal led to this.
Definitely. And, I'm hearing you talk about a better world, but also in your talk, I heard you imagine I don't like that term, better way to do journalism, but a much better way to do journalism that is nuanced and just very comprehensive. So I wanted to get a little bit into your reporting process and specifically talk about something that I know is very dear to you, source diversity. I remember and was extremely impressed that I think it was a late summer 2020 piece where you've said you've already talked to over 100 experts, and I assume that's not including patients.
So that actually is including patients.
Oh, it is.
I include them in that category. Yeah.
Sure.
So, but so you finish your question, and I'll say more.
Definitely. So I just wanted to ask how you build these relationships, because every time I click on a story that you've written, I know that it's going to be extremely unique, and I'm going to hear from somebody who I haven't heard before. So how are you constantly building that Rolodex, if you will?
With some difficulty, partly it's that challenge that I talked about in the talk about wanting to make sure that half of the people in every story are just people I've never spoken to before. And that's for many reasons. I want to hear viewpoints that I maybe not heard. I want to hear from people who aren't in the media spotlight all the time. And because I think that the structures of the media push us into some really unhealthy habits. A lot of people talk to exactly the same people again and again. They get a very narrow set of perspectives. Those people then, get a bigger audience. They tweet the pieces of the people who are writing about them. And it also just sort of spirals into a place where a lot of people suddenly get much, much larger platforms and larger followings, but we're not necessarily, as a citizenry, better informed as a result. I just think that there are a lot of really interesting people to talk to. Every time I do this, when I find new sources, I never regret it. I don't think like, oh man, I just wish I called up the same person again. And there are obviously people who I love talking to, like time and again. But I always hear from people who have fascinating perspectives. You mentioned source diversity. I try and make sure that at least half the people that I talk to are women, at least a quarter of people of color. I should really be more. I try to represent a lot of perspectives from disabled people and scholars of disability. Did that quite early on in the pandemic, and that's been instrumental in shaping my understanding of what is happening. And you talked about patients. I regard long haulers as experts on their condition, and usually way more so than academics who've also studied the condition. They know their disease inside out, many of them. And it's not just expertise from a patient perspective, right? So many of the people I talk to are in PubMed. They are reading papers, including papers that people who with medical degrees are not reading. So yeah, I think a lot of this is about gauging people's expertise and turning to the right experts. And to me, for long COVID stories, that's long haulers. Like, I'm interested in the people who treat them because they have a specific perspective, but that perspective isn't weighted any greater in my mind in terms of actually understanding the disease. Often people with medical backgrounds are talking absolute nonsense about long COVID. So yeah, I think it's about trying to assess people's expertise, trying to get a wide range of different expertise.
Are you asking people who you are already interviewing for other people to talk to? Are you doing a lot of research into people who you organically reach out to one-on-one? What is that like?
Yeah, often. So one of, I think, the most potent ways of finding good people to talk to is to ask folks. Some of my most trusted sources are people who not only, I think, have interesting opinions and well-considered arguments, but also people who are absolutely willing to share their platforms and to point me to other people who are more knowledgeable than they are. Honestly, what to me, one of my markers of trust in a source are people who are very specific about what they know and what they don't know. People who tell me, I actually don't know anything about that, you should talk to the following person, always get a tick in my view. The people who you see in news broadcast after news broadcast or story after story weighing in on basically everything in the pandemic, you might want to think about whether those people actually know what they're talking about, because no one knows that much about everything.
That's absolutely true. And here's a follow-up question from our audience that is about COVID being a really emotionally fraught time. How do you approach interviewing somebody in those difficult conversations and circumstances, whether it be long haulers or medical workers and nurses? Go down the line, right?
Yeah, it's hard, I try and be as empathetic as possible because I actually do really care. I think there's often this perception of like we sometimes valorize being an asshole, because we kind of associate the qualities of assholes, like just being hard-nosed and with our values as journalists. But I think you can get the story and you can find out what is happening and you can hold power to account without crushing the spirits of vulnerable people who've been through a lot. So I try and be very sensitive to the people who I'm talking to. And I find, like, I talked about the value of empathy. Like, the empathy isn't just a cloak that I'm putting on. It is at the core of what I'm trying to do with my reporting. So when I'm interviewing healthcare workers and long haulers, I actually want to know, like, how are you feeling? Right? How has all of this affected your life? Like, your thoughts? What do you see when you go to bed at night? Like, what do you, what are your frustrations? And I think that helps in the interviews. I think it comes through in the work. And I think people are often prepared to be really open and vulnerable when they feel that someone actually really is listening to them. And this sort of goes back to the question about trust, right? About establishing trust. There's no other way around it other than to really be worthy of that trust. And there's no way around that than to actually, like, really want to listen to people and to hear their stories. Like, I don't think you can, I mean, maybe some people can fake empathy, but, I'm not a high functioning sociopath. I actually need to feel it. And I do. It's why I do this. It's why I do the pieces that I'm doing now.
Absolutely. And I think that empathy and your resonance with readers shows in kind of the glimpses that you've given us into your email inbox.
Thank you.
I have a question. Go ahead.
No, please, you go.
My next question was actually about your email inbox.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, we have both developed expertise in the pandemic as a result of covering it. And I feel like every other week I get questions from friends who say, my roommate got COVID. What do I do? How often should I test? So many other questions. And of course, the pandemic is always changing. So I kind of want to hear, you know, what are people still asking you, whether it's readers or your families and friends who are texting you? What are you observing as questions that have yet to be answered? Or maybe are you observing questions that they're forgetting to ask?
Oh, what excellent questions. You know, I actually don't get that much from like the people who are closest to me, because I kind of think they get it. You know, I have selected very hard in my life for a specific kind of person to invest in for friendships. So I find it I don't really have a challenge in trying to explain the collective nature of our problems to the people who I love the most. They just fundamentally get it. You know, they have different attitudes about their own risk analysis, but I think that, I think that they're all intelligent and primarily selfless people, and they like. I think they know what to do. I think for me the the things that animate the work that I'm currently doing and the way I'm thinking about the pandemic is I'm trying to think about who gets left behind. Less like what is my risk, but who bears the collective risk that remains. And I'm trying to do that because, you know, the media is for very privileged people. I'm a very privileged person. It is journalists were disproportionately vaccinated, right? Like we have the privilege of immunity. The media is disproportionately male and disproportionately white. And I think that the takes about the pandemic now are reflecting that skew. We have, endless series of op-eds from people who got vaccinated early and want to get back to normal and are just a bit bored with everyone else not doing that. We have far fewer from communities who have been severely impacted by the pandemic and continue to be. The number of pieces that argue that everyone is overreacting and that completely think about this in terms of individual risk severely outnumber the pieces by immunocompromised folks, by communities of color that have disproportionately borne the brunt of deaths and hospitalizations, by healthcare workers who are still struggling on the front lines rather than spending most of their time writing pieces or advising policymakers. The voices in public health who get the most airtime are academics in coastal universities rather than people working in your local public health department who haven't had a break for 2.5 years. So if we are not giving those people a platform, then I sort of see my responsibility as trying to work towards that and rectify that balance. It is said that our job is to comfort the afflicted, and afflict the comfortable. It feels like as the pandemic wears on, in fact, what we're doing is coddling the privileged and privileging the coddled. And I don't want to do that. I think it sort of betrays the tenets of our profession and it does a disservice to the readers who most need our service.
I absolutely agree. So, Ed, we have time for one more question, and I wanted to end with the hope of you giving us a glimpse into what's to come, maybe with your work. So, but I'm actually phrasing this question a little differently, which is, if you had unlimited time, money, no editorial oversight, what element of COVID or not COVID are you looking forward to writing about?
As I've said, writing about COVID has and continues to take a toll on my mental health, and I don't know how long I can continue to do that. To be honest, it really has felt like staring constantly at the sun for 2 years, and there's now this weird spiral where I know I only have so much emotional energy and mental energy to spend on this without wrecking myself. So I want to spend it on the stories that matter the most. But the stories that matter the most are also the most emotionally exhausting because they feature the people who've had the hardest time with it. So it's a little bit of a vicious cycle, and I don't really know how to pull out of that. But the work needs to be done, and I will continue to do it as long as I can. If I had infinite resources, I would frankly hire a lot of people who I think in the same way. I'm very proud of the work that my immediate team at The Atlantic, people like Catherine, Katie Wu, and Sarah Zhang, and our editor Sarah Lasco have accomplished. Other folks like Amanda Mull and Rachel Gutman are also doing fantastic work. I would hire a lot of people who are thinking along the same lines, and by that I don't mean like we all agree on everything. We don't, but I think that the frames of analysis, the thoughtfulness and care with which they approach that work inspire me. And I think there are a lot of other journalists who actually are thinking about this along those lines. You and I could reel off tons of names, but I think like Amy Maxman has constantly looked at people at the plight of marginalized groups throughout this pandemic. Ushali McFarlane has done the same. I always forget the names of everyone who I've ever read during exercises like this. But the point is that there are a lot of journalists who are still doing incredible work. They're not necessarily the ones with the biggest platforms. And I think that the part of the problem now is trying to match up the platforms with the people who are actually producing the best stuff. I think that we are very, very far from being a meritocracy, and I think that power and resources can help to address some of that. I've tried to be mindful of that over the last 2 years plus as my own status and platform has grown. I've tried to push forward the work of other people who I think are, similarly sacrificing their mental health and producing the best work of their careers. I don't know how sustainable all of this is, but I do think it still matters, and it needs to be done for as long as I can keep doing it.
Yeah. Well, Ed, thank you again for all your work, and meanwhile, maybe bring some sunglasses every so often.
That's a really good idea. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in.
Thanks, Udan. It's been great.
It was an honor to host Ed Yong in 2022 and to bring him back on our podcast today. If you enjoyed listening, we welcome you to join us in person or online for our 37th season as we hear from authors like Hanif Abdurraqib, Kevin Kwan, and Sipam Zhang. Tickets are available at lectures.org. Thank you to the Seattle Arts and Lectures staff, board, and community, and thanks to all of you for listening. This show would not be possible without you. Our show is produced by Jack Straw Cultural Center with theme music by Daniel Spills. To hear more, subscribe from wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, rate and review us 5 stars so that more people can enjoy Sal on Air.